Pretty smart feller. Can you imagine being so smart that no one dared to ask you any more questions? I don't know what that means other than maybe they're afraid your answer is going to be way up here and you don't understand it. Or if you're trying to trick somebody and that person's so smart, there's no way you're going to do that. That's who Jesus was. He gave one of the best answers, I think, really in the Bible to a question. This question was posed by what we call a scribe, which was really nothing more than a religious lawyer in that time and place. All the lawyers were religious lawyers, and they were called scribes. And this scribe had asked Jesus, which is the greatest commandment? Because they had over 600, right? Which one's the best? And Jesus draws from a couple of places in the Torah, not just one place, but a couple, and he gives the answer, well, you need to love God, and you need to love your neighbor, and with a little elaboration, which I'll talk about in a moment. But notice here that Jesus is preaching to the choir. He's preaching to the choir. The scribe, being a scribe, was a very loyal person. He was loyal to his faith. It was his profession. It was his entire life. It was all-consuming. So Jesus is not telling this man something he didn't already know. And by me sort of sharing this news and telling you that you must love God and love your neighbor, I am also preaching to the choir this morning, so to speak, which I'll explain in a moment. Not just you guys, I'm talking to everybody. But it's not like you've never heard that before. How many of you have never heard you're supposed to love God and love your neighbor? Pretty much everybody. Preaching to the choir means to offer an opinion or a perspective to those who already accept it. Okay? You're preaching to the choir. And by the way, it does sort of imply, does it not, that choir members are the most loyal and faithful of all church members? You agree with that? Not to disparage our choir members, but that's not always true. I read about a choir director who was very frustrated with the sporadic attendance of all of the choir members for weekly rehearsals for the Christmas cantata. You know how long you have to practice for your Christmas thing, right? Went on, and it was very sporadic attendance. So at the final rehearsal, right before the day of the event, the choir director announced, I want to personally thank the pianist for being the only person in the entire choir to attend each and every rehearsal for the past 2 months. And at this, the pianist rose from his chair, he bowed, and he said, it was the least I could do, considering the fact that I will not be able to attend the Christmas cantata tonight. It's frustrating, right, Paul? You got a good group here, though. But despite that story, it goes without saying that choir members are often among the most loyal and faithful of all church members because it just requires a certain level of dedication. And so the phrase preaching to the choir, which refers to preaching to people who already agree with you, has some merit. It's a valid phrase. Now, I don't want to get too far off track this morning, but I'm going to anyway. I did a little research about the origin of that phrase, preaching to the choir, and it turns out it hasn't been around very long. The first we find it in written literature is only back in 1973. It was found in a newspaper article from Ohio. First we know where it came from, according to my sources. I have sources, that work behind me in my office. The phrase might not be very old, but it does express the same idea that we find in an earlier phrase, which was preaching to the converted. Preaching to the converted. We don't hear that as much. We normally hear preaching to the choir. But preaching to the converted was originally how it came about. And that phrase really only goes back to the late 19th century, and it is first cited in the works of John Stuart Mill, who's a British philosopher of note. And Mill wrote about a man preaching, quote, not only to a person already converted, but an actual missionary of the same doctrine. You imagine preaching to a missionary of your faith. That would be a complete waste of time, right? Well, we'll see. By the way, I found this phrase eloquently included in a book by the late chaplain from Harvard University. His name was Peter Gomes. Very smart guy. Gomes said this in one of his books: "It is my highest hope to appeal," and he did this with a British accent, by the way, I don't know why, and I can't do it, but "it is my highest hope to appeal not so much to those who are already set in their convictions, but to that vast company of readers willing to investigate a point of view that may not be its own. Preaching to the converted, and, depending on which one, the choir, is a waste of time. And I believe in the hope of doing better than that." Gomes had a way with words, a very flowery way of writing. And I understand his sentiment here. And so I honestly hope that there might be somebody here this morning who is not already utterly convinced that our greatest calling in life is to love God and to love our neighbors. It's entirely probable, however, that I am, for the most part, merely preaching to the choir this morning, to the converted, that is, to the loyalists of the faith. Let me go a little further off track. When we think of loyalty, have you ever noticed that it is the most prized virtue of the canine species? I'm not talking about cats, right, because they are disloyal. But I'm talking about dogs. Dogs are known for their loyalty. Or are they? The Jewish German writer Karl Kraus once said, "To be sure, the dog is loyal, but why on that account, should we take him as an example? He is loyal to men, not to other dogs." That's a strangely interesting and good point. So maybe we should look for an example of loyalty from the human species. And I was thinking about loyalty last Tuesday night when my wife and I attended the Elton John Farewell Yellow Brick Road concert, right? And it was at the Scott Trade Center. At one point in the concert, he got a little talkative at times, but he had just noted that he had been playing concerts for 50 years. Think about that, 50 years. And he paused to thank all of his loyal fans, those who had bought the 45s and the LPs and the 8-tracks and the cassettes and the CDs. He was giving his age away, right? And had bought tickets for his concerts. And I was sitting there thinking, what's the last thing I bought that Elton John did? It was an 8-track tape. And I thought, but I'm still a loyalist, right? Because I bought an 8-track tape. Loved Elton John. A wonderful and well-known example of loyalty is found in our lesson today. We heard from the book of Ruth. As you know, Ruth was a Moabite, and she became the daughter-in-law of Naomi, and Naomi was an Israelite. Naomi and her husband and 2 sons had gone to live in Moab because there was a severe famine in the land of Israel. So they journey off to Moab, and while there, the 2 sons meet a couple of Moabite women and they get married. But unfortunately, after 10 years of living in Moab, Naomi's husband and her 2 sons all die. They pass away. And so it's just her and her 2 daughters-in-law. And in the meantime, the famine in Israel has subsided, and so Naomi decides, I can go back home. So she tells her daughters-in-law that she's going to go back home, and they say, well, we want to go with you. And she says, no, you need to stay here in your land with your people and your God, and this is where you belong, so stay here. And of course, Orpah agrees for some reason. But Ruth, however, clings to Naomi. Maybe she had grown closer to Naomi than Orpah had. And she delivers one of the most beautiful statements on loyalty in the entire Bible, maybe Western literature itself. She said, do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. Here we find the loyalty of a foreign daughter-in-law to be more powerful than the loyalty of man's best friend or lifelong fans of Elton John. And it's interesting because in our popular culture, mothers-in-law are usually portrayed as being antagonistic or competitive with their sons and daughters-in-law. So it's interesting. But many, if not most of you here today have that same level of Ruth-like loyalty to this church and to the teachings of the gospel. And you will likely be a member here when you die, and your name is also read during Totenfest. And so because of that, almost every Sunday to me feels like preaching to the choir, preaching to the converted, preaching to the loyalist. And so when I repeat Jesus' words to love God that we've heard our entire lives and love our neighbors, you're already there. At least in theory, you're there. As Jesus said to the scribe, and it applies to all of us here today, you are not far from the kingdom of God. But here's the thing about being not far from the kingdom of God. There is still a little ways to go. For sure, we've all bought into the concept of loving God, but notice what Jesus also said, quoting from the Torah. We are to love God with all our heart, and with all our soul, and with all our mind, and with all our strength. If we take that seriously, there's not much time or energy for anything else, right? That pretty much fills up our calendars. And while we, the loyal followers of Jesus, are mulling over the intensity of those words, like a good boxer, Jesus follows his left hook, which is love God, with an uppercut, which is love your neighbor as much as you love yourselves. Is there a higher calling than that anywhere else in our lives and on any billboard or other religious propaganda or holy books or philosophies or anything? Is there anything higher than that to love our neighbors as much as we love ourselves? Isn't that setting the bar really high? And I'm not quite sure we're ever really going to get there. We may not be far from the kingdom of God, but we always have a ways to go. And this is why preaching to the choir is not a waste of time, even as great as these people are right here. Because even the most loyal of Jesus' followers will always need to be in an improvement mode. Just as a choir can always improve by adding new voices or new songs to their repertoire, you and I can always improve our loyalty to Jesus by adding more and more levels of love to our repertoire. And as long as you're willing to do that, I'll continue preaching to the choir, happily so. Amen.